April 15th.
Okay, same as Good Friday. Chris, you want to take the lead?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special edition, a Friday edition. We should have an exclusive title like Lunch and Learn on the Weekend. Well, it's not technically the weekend, but
Fabulous Fridays.
Fabulous Fridays. We are excited. So this is actually a part 2 to a Lunch and Learn that we had the previous week. I believe it was Wednesday, February 23rd, if I'm just throwing random dates out of my head. But anyways, we had a part 1 really talking about what are some of the reasons that we see that ERP isn't always as successful as it can be. And then Liz and John both really talked about the idea of how adding an acceptance of uncertainty is the new gold standard for ERP. So a lot of people were super excited. We had a great group of people that tuned in, plenty of questions. And so we got so to the point where we felt so guilty because we had so many questions we couldn't respond to. So we decided, let's have a part 2. So we are excited to be back here for part 2 of Lunch and Learn, the new gold standard ERP. We always love for everyone to kind of drop in the chat. Where are you from? Where are you tuning in from? Say hi to everybody. We love the community that's in the chat. So many different people really like to engage with each other. So feel free to do that on whatever site you're in. We're going to keep these opening announcements quick because we want to jump into it. Remember that this is not a crisis line. So the IOCDF obviously is here to support. We want to offer you a sense of community, but we're not a crisis line. So if you're going or experiencing a crisis, please, or feeling unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or go to the suicide prevention hotline, which is 800-273-8255. Also, if you want to learn about the upcoming live streams, make sure to go to iocf.org/peace of mind. You can drop in questions as well as ideas and topics for future streams, or go to iocf.org/live if you want to learn different ways that you can be watching our live streams. And as always, we want to create a happy and comfortable and safe community. So please be respectful as you post on the social media sites. And remember that we are recording this for later viewership. But without further ado, we're excited to have John Grayson back and to jump into part 2. And we have plenty of questions. If you asked questions last time, we got them all down. And we understand that you're going to want to ask new questions as well. So we're going to get to as many as we can.
Yes. So hi, everyone. Hi, Aaron. Hi, Deirdre. Hi, Let's Go. I like that name because I like it's just like, hey, let's jump in. And you started with a question. So that's fun. So we can hop into those. But John, before we do, can you just pick up where we left off? So the concept of ERP plus accepting uncertainty was something we really, not to say introduced for the first time, I hope people have heard of it, but we're really trying to introduce it within one acronym and how it really is the approach to successful ERP. So if you want to share a little bit more just about what we mean by that, where it came from, because today I want us to jump into questions, but I also want us to do a little bit of like, okay, so what does this look like for scrupulosity? What does this look like for contamination? So people can hear real life applicable examples.
You know, you just turned my comments into a 3-hour talk. But I'll try not. But there, you know what? There is, I think, coming up in April, there is a 2-hour talk on that topic of just kind of the concept of accepting uncertainty for all the different forms of OCD. Because you and I kind of introduced this, you know, ERP to be the gold standard has to have the gold. So we use the chemical symbol AU for that, ERP plus AU. And AU just happens to be accepting uncertainty. Too often we see people who have gone through treatment and never been told that accepting uncertainty is part of it. So they're kind of expecting, you know, I'm afraid I'm going to die from this. I'm going to do all this exposure. Well, why am I going to stop being afraid I'm going to die? And so, you know, the idea is like, oh, you have to learn to live with risk the same way you get in a car and risk death, the same way, you know, whatever you're scared of, I could find something else you could be scared of that you're not scared of. You just live with the risk of it. So we're saying that for treatment to really work, you know, the goal of exposure is to help you live with uncertainty. And that means I'm going to hope that I can cope with the risk if it you know, if a risk happens, I hope I can cope with it. I hope if there's something weird like a worldwide pandemic that I'll find a way to cope with it and live with it. So I'll turn it back to the questions unless you want me to go on and on. But
No, I love it. I love it. I think the reminder is ERP is when we do targeted exposures, right, for our triggers, the things that we may avoid or the things that cause us anxiety. So we're doing an exposure and we're preventing that compulsion or response. The accepting uncertainty is really where the gold happens. It's what we talked a lot about, because it's about accepting and leaning into the fear, the core fear that you have around that exposure, right? We can do targeted exposures and constantly be playing this game of whack-a-mole where we're just addressing each new trigger, each new compulsion, each new fear all the time, like on the surface. Or we can go deep and we can do the targeted exposures and address the core, right? What's really underneath it, to allow this to not feel like we're constantly, dealing with Pandora's box. We just knock it out at the root.
And then just one last thing to add to that is, we say accepting uncertainty, and I wish it was that easy, but in treatment, our goal is to help people learn how to accept uncertainty. Because if it's just as simple as accepting it, I can treat everybody in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, I'll accept uncertainty. But so it's something one has to learn to do.
It's a work in progress.
Trick. Yes.
Work in progress. I love it. I was just thinking as I was giving that analogy that it reminds me of like when you pick weeds, and the difference of like just picking the top when you didn't get that root out and you're like, well, that's going to come back, versus when you actually get the root and you're like, all right, sweet. Like I've solved this situation from this one weed for today. Think about that with this treatment. So Chris, let's hop in. Do you want to start with live questions or pre-submitted?
Yeah, let's start with a live question. The one that I saw first and I was kind of looking over is at your time, East Coast, 12:06 for Skyla. Can you talk about compulsion versus talking back to OCD? Can you also address when it's okay to reject a thought and replace with another thought without making it a compulsion? That's from Ansa.
I think talking back to OCD, and I guess that's where our idea of accepting uncertainty comes in, because talking back to OCD doesn't mean I'm going to say, this is a silly thought. What I'm afraid of is not going to happen. Because if that worked, then you'd already be better, because everybody, almost everybody with OCD has said that. I think talking back to OCD is kind of looking at like, what have I lost to OCD? And in what way has it ruined my life? How has this hurt my family? How does this prevent me from moving forward? This thing that I'm scared of, do my compulsions actually significantly make it less likely to happen? Because if I pursue this, I'm not going to have a life, and the terrible thing can happen anyway. So I think of some version of that is talking back to OCD. And I think the fact that I'm always acknowledging, and I think, I never, if I'm doing imaginal exposure, I never say, X has happened. It's always, if X happens, because uncertainty works both ways. It might happen, it might not happen. We don't know. But if it happens, and then we talk about all the awful things, and then we do another critical thing. How will you try to cope with it? Because too often, I think we mentioned this last time, somebody thinks like, what if this horrible thing happens? Or just something would affect everybody, whether, even with OCD, like, what if your kid dies? And every parent's like, that's it. I don't want to think anymore. But something actually happens next. So no matter how mild or not mild, like, how would I move on and cope with it? Because you can't do what you won't imagine. So trying to imagine. I just had this with a client the other day who is a hypochondriac, and she was afraid of getting cancer. And I asked her, well, what would you do if you had cancer? And we go through what's seemingly horrendous. You're like all the different stages of what would happen. And the next week she said, like, it's kind of weird. I felt better after that. But it seems like she should feel worse. But she felt better, not because like, oh, wow, that's great. I can have cancer and die happily. She felt better. It's like, oh, this is where I would go. Not that it's great, but it's like, it's not like everything stops and it ends. It's like, all right, I would do this and I would do this. It gave a form to how to keep going on. So I think that's how we talk back.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I want to push that. I actually do think that replacing thoughts with like a positive thought can become a compulsion. And so I just want to say that, you know, if I've certainly seen a lot of patients before where they have, you know, whatever the intrusive thought might be. And so they replace it with like, oh, but I'm a great person. I wouldn't do something bad. Or I know, right. Like any of that can certainly serve. And so the question I would ask you is, does the replacement thought or does talking back to OCD give you immediate relief? Because if it does, might be a compulsion, and maybe we should treat it as that, compared to if it doesn't give us relief and it continues to make us have to lean into that fear, then it's probably okay and healthy.
And one last thing, I'm so sorry, because I just realized I don't think we actually ever try to replace a thought, you know, because that gets back into I'm going to stop thinking, you know, and if anybody knows how to do that, let me know, because I think it'd be kind of interesting. You know, and I think, you know, in a way, this is partially where mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness isn't like I'm doing this other thing or I'm paying attention to the real world. I'm paying attention to what I like and all that other stuff goes away. No, it's like all that other stuff is still there. I'm choosing to go forward with it still there, you know. And so like for most people, if they have a headache, they don't stop life, you know. So it's like you work with a headache, or if it's not a headache that does it, or some other stress, you keep going on. So it's really not replacing it, it's doing it and it's also continuing to live while I have this stuff in my head, is practicing not letting OCD take over my life. Because if I just stop everything to do my compulsion, I just make more room for compulsion. So I'm doing and, not or.
Absolutely. One of the pre-submitted questions, this was a question live from last time, I think is good. They asked, does your exposure ever have an endpoint? So their example they gave is, let's say there's a fear that you're going to die on a certain day. Once that day is over and you've sat with the uncertainty, has the exposure ended? So I think a lot of people ask that. When do they know that they can sort of end an exposure? Is there ever an end? Do you keep doing it for life? Like, how do you know when an exposure is concluded?
So I'll take this one because I have a lot of thoughts around it. In particular, one of the things I've seen happen is I've heard some OCD clinicians will say things to patients like, you know, we'll do this exposure and then just see if it comes true, right? So if you have a fear that your mom's going to die in a car accident, let's do this exposure and let's just see if it happens. And like, it makes me cringe when people do that, just because it's like, okay, well then we're not actually doing the exposure with uncertainty, right? What we're actually doing is we're saying, okay, I'm willing to do this exposure as long as I can wait and be sure nothing bad happens. And so that actually reinforces that there is something even dangerous to begin with, that we need to see if it comes true and see if it's on the lookout. And so what I would push is that your exposures never end, because you're living in an exposure, because the exposure is actually uncertainty. And so if you accept uncertainty, you're not waiting for the exposure to be done, right? Because if you're waiting for the exposure to end, then what that tells me is that you're waiting to make sure nothing bad happened, or you're waiting to make sure it was okay or it was safe. And that in and of itself is actually just a compulsion or avoidance, right? But we're waiting to be sure versus no, like we're leaning into the uncertainty around this.
And just to add on to that, adding on to you were talking about gardens earlier, Liz, but that's perfect for exposure too, because, you know, after you do this massive work and clear out all the weeds and you plant this beautiful garden, you still have to weed. That's always there. It's just that the continuous weeding keeps it maintained, as opposed to looking like this overgrown thing. And you know, the idea of behavioral experiments, I only agree with you about 100%. And I won't tell the full story the way I always prefer, but everyone's heard it, which is, but I had a client who was worried that her thoughts could kill people. She had a great reason for thinking it. I said, maybe they can kill people, that we're going to do exposure, having them try to kill people, not to prove she can't do it, but to have her getting used to living with the thoughts, and that somebody might die during treatment. First week of treatment, we work on killing her dad. And at the end of the week, he died.
Okay, John.
But you know, but here's the thing, you know, and I asked, did he kill him? And a lot of people go, no. And it's like, well, I don't think she killed him, but I don't know. But the thing is, she agreed to do treatment that way. So it wasn't like, oh, shoot, now what do we do? You know, because it happened, you know.
Yeah.
Unlikely things happen. She continued treatment. She didn't kill anyone else, and got better. So, right, it's I don't care how unlikely it is. Some unlikely things happen. Was it coincidence, or this is the one time she had the power?
Exactly.
Definitely, maybe.
Well, and the thing is, right, is you think about it with any fear, like you think about a fear, someone who has, I have a fear of HIV, right? That's something I've struggled a lot with is bloodborne illness fears. I could do an exposure and say, okay, I'm going to wait and see if I get HIV, and I could get tested and I don't, and I feel better. And then maybe I decide, okay, well, I'm going to, and then maybe one day I have HIV. Is it because I did exposures around it? No, because the exposures aren't actually putting me at risk. It would be because of other things, right? And so again, we want to make sure that if we're doing OCD to prove something, we're still holding on to OCD. We're still wanting certainty. We're still wanting an answer, whether it's to prove it one way or the other. And so the goal is to lean into it. And it's the same with pedophilia fears. You know, Callie and some others and I, Chris, we submitted this to IOCDF. We talk a lot about this. The goal is not that you become okay with being a pedophile in treatment, right? Most people, like that goes against who we are. That isn't what we would want. But the goal is that we lean into the uncertainty that, like, we can't be sure, but we're not trying to prove whether we're a pedophile or not, because that's like, we will never be able to fully prove that, right? Instead, we're trying to lean into the uncertainty that, like, like maybe we are, maybe we aren't, and I'm still going to live my life the way I want.
And I would still ask that person, if you woke up tomorrow and you were 100% sure that you were a pedophile, what would you do next? You know, and some people go, I'd kill myself. It's like, okay, you can't kill yourself because that's an avoidance, so you're condemned to life. You know, and they tell me that they'd be a terrible person. I say, well, you know, for all we know, there might be a bunch of pedophiles around who never do it. And we don't hear about them because they have the thoughts and they don't want to do it. And I point out, I ask, do they, you know, when they see an attractive individual, do they usually go up to them and ask if they can sleep with them? I haven't run into somebody who says yes. So, but pointing out, like, I can have a desire, not even giving in. And then they're, you know, they want to feel they're a horrible person. But usually I ask, like, so if you had a sib who came to you and confessed that, like, I have these thoughts, I would never give in, you would tell them they're horrible. And usually they're much nicer to their family than themselves. So, but then again, it's like, how would you live with the worst? You know, you suddenly wake up and you know this is true. You know, because all we have are the odds. Probably you're not, but odds are odds. Maybe there'll be a worldwide pandemic.
Maybe not. So let's go back to 12:02 Eastern time. Chris, the question is, when dealing with uncertainty, when specific fears pop in, do you focus on the uncertainty of the specific fear or just keep a general sense of uncertainty? So great question. And maybe this would be an opportunity, Chris, after you answer this, to also, we can go into a specific of like a contamination fear or whatever, and kind of play out what ERP without uncertainty would look like versus ERP with.
Yeah, with the first part of the question, though, specific fears pop in, do you focus on the certainty of the specific fear? That was really what we were talking about in that first point of where people get stuck is, you know, they get triggered by something and they're so honed in on that fear. So you were talking, Liz, about like HIV fears. So somebody can focus all on HIV fears, and let's say they have a fear of all different bloodborne illnesses, or they have another subtype, maybe they have incest intrusive thoughts, or they have, you know, another subtype. What I don't like clients to get trapped into is this, literally, I think of like whack-a-mole. It's like, this is my fear. I attack this fear. I'm feeling better about this fear. There's a larger lesson to be, to be learned here. And I've been sending the link to part 1 to everybody I know, because what we talked about in part 1 is there's a larger message that's hidden in an exposure. Basically, like John was saying, I mean, we've all been living through a pandemic. We get in our cars. There's so much uncertainty we deal with, and we just don't even think about it. However, with OCD, there's this need to complete, to figure out, to fix, to get a complete understanding. So if you have to do that for every single intrusive thought and trigger you have for the rest of your life, you're going to be exhausted, because you're going to be doing exposures until you're 103. If instead we take a step back and say, okay, what I'm learning is I can't fully 100% prevent myself from getting HIV. I can take certain smart choices, like if I'm going to have sex, use protection, things like that, not share needles with other drug users, etc. But after that, there's a point where I can't fully prevent it from happening 100%, and I have to just move on and learn to live that there's always going to be a part of there where something bad could happen or could not happen. What I always really encourage clients to do is, what messaging did we just learn from that exposure? How can we take it and make it universal to not only all different parts of OCD, but in life in general? Because you're going to buy a house one day, you have no clue if the foundation is perfect, if there's something the realtor didn't tell you, and that may not be an OCD fear, but there's a level of uncertainty when buying a house, moving cross country for a job. So the goal is to start getting to a point for people to learn about uncertainty across the board versus one specific fear.
100%. So I would just say too, if you're dealing with a specific fear, address the uncertainty for that fear, but really it's about the concept overall. And this is what I tell our patients here, and I know we all tell our patients that we work with, is it would be a disservice for me to only teach you how to address your current symptoms, right? The goal of treatment is that we help you understand how, just like Lorena said at 11:14, that this is exposure lifestyle. This becomes a lifestyle, right? It's kind of like dieting. Do we want to go on a fad diet where it might work, but like it's not maintainable? Or do we want to do something that's truly a change in our life and it's a lifestyle change that we can maintain? We want you to see that this treatment, and John and I are pushing this and a lot of others, that it's not just for OCD. It helps you live freely across the board, because for anybody, even who doesn't have OCD, that wants to pretend that they never have to accept uncertainty, let me know who you are and explain that to us, because I'd be curious how it's going. Because if you are doing that, I bet you're not living freely.
Agreed. I was going to say really quick about lifestyle. I used to run gyms, so the example I usually give is working out. I mean, yes, in the beginning, you're learning how to work out, and your trainer is going to give you specifics. You're going to work out together, but eventually it becomes a lifestyle. Pretty soon, you know, when you go out to a restaurant, you start to eat a certain way, or you pick certain foods because that's better for, you know, the goals that you have. You're more active. You spend times on the weekends working out. You don't feel 10 years later that you're like trying to get into this mindset. It becomes a lifestyle of health. And it's the same with uncertainty. And, you know, John, you said it last time about people becoming stronger after OCD treatment. And like I said, I agree, because, you know, clients who don't have fears about buying houses or, you know, getting married to someone, there's still always going to be some level of uncertainty in it. And you have to take a risk and go for it.
Agreeing to this webinar with y'all at 11 my time, even though I love seeing you guys, right? That like there was total uncertainty in that. Like I assume I can make it. I plan my schedule, but I have no idea. Like things, right? Everything you do in life, you're accepting uncertainty, whether or not we want to acknowledge it or see it. And hopefully we can get you to a healthy place where you don't even have to see it and acknowledge it, right? I don't want every choice of uncertainty in your day to be a trigger and to be hard. We want it to just be the way we live our life, and it doesn't really stop or impact us. I love this next pre-submitted question. So John, I'm throwing it to you, but if both your compulsions and your values are to protect your family, then what do you do to overcome this? And this is so great, because this is the question we get all the time, is like, well, you want me to address uncertainty, but it's something that I truly value. And I really actually like want good relationships, right? But OCD, guess what? It attacks what means the most to us, not things we don't care about. So what should they do?
I mean, it would be, I mean, I'll give the general answer. I'd be curious to hear this person's individual, but, you know, the question is, yes, it's nice to protect your family. To what extent are your rituals actually protecting your family? To what extent is it a low probability you're protecting them? And, you know, if this person's going to say they're going to do anything for their family, because that's important, I would simply say to them that you're a liar. Because how much are you hurting your family with your rituals? You know, and if you have a family and you have OCD, I'd be saying, do you want your children to be like you? And if the answer is not yes, you know, the answer is no, then it's like, why not? You know, this is the right way. Why wouldn't you want them? So, you know, what you're teaching your children is to be OCD. So are you protecting them? Because whatever you're protecting them from is still possibly going to happen. And you probably say you're not doing, you know, unless you're, well, which way do you want to harm your children? You know, because if you're going to protect them that much, they're going to be full of fear, not being able to live life. And they're going to be an anxious mess. Is that what you want for their future life? That part's highly likely. Also, if you're giving into your OCD, if your child doesn't have OCD, they're just going to think you're a nut. So whatever you're trying to protect them from, they're not going to do. And if you're forcing your family to do all this stuff, you actually think they're doing it when you're not around. And if you do, you're a little bit delusional. So you're doing all these rituals and you're not even getting the goal. You're not even getting the big reward. And you're messing up your family and harming them, which might lead ultimately to the breakup of your family. Because, you know, I think if you're doing that to your kids, it's not going to be a really good marriage. So then if you get divorced, you're not going to be able to protect them anyway. So everything are odds, but, you know, it turns out protecting them. You know, I tell new parents that whatever you do with your children, you are guilty. Every decision you make is one of two mistakes. Either you're overprotective and that's why they, can't handle anything and they're a mess, or you weren't protective enough and that's why they broke their leg. There is no middle ground. So which way do you want to harm them? So, and it's not like at least they're going to be alive, but a complete mess. You're not even making sure they're alive. So we try to teach them and we hope it's balanced. And the thing that saves our children reliably is luck. So it's not, it's the odds. Most of the time bad stuff doesn't happen, but it does.
And I think that the point is, right, is that this is the OCD trap that pulls everyone in, right? Is, well, wait a second, like, you want me to do exposures around this, but like, I'm supposed to live by my values, but it is my value to protect my family, to not cause harm to people I love, to, engage with my faith, whatever it might be. And so what I would push is, are you actually living by your values or are you living by OCD? And our goal is to get you back living by your values, right? If family is important to you, I want you to live freely with your family, because I don't think your value is to engage with your family in OCD manners and in OCD's way.
Exposure is not, and what we're trying to do in a case like that, we're turning exposure not into confronting your fear. Exposure, in that case, is an act of love. Because even though it's scaring me, I am putting my family's welfare above my fear.
Yep.
Because if I don't do that, I'm like praying to the OC demon.
Yeah. What I just wanted to add quickly, and putting on my lived experience hat, once you start to go through treatment, what you also learn is it's not really about your family. I mean, OCD preyed on that because you care about your family, but you start to realize it's not about family. The reason I'm compelled to do these, I don't do this with clients right out the gate, but having gone through it myself, I started to learn, because I had some OCD stuff about harm, and you do start to feel righteous, like, well, my therapist doesn't understand. I have to do this because I love my grandma and sister and I have to protect them. It wasn't about that for me. I started to realize, no, it's more selfish. I don't like to feel anxious. I don't like uncertainty. And my grandma, my sister, my littlest sister, the OCD preyed on them because they were the most helpless two people that lived around me. The OCD is attacking this idea that I might harm them. They're chilling. They're fine. In fact, they want me to get better because my OCD is driving them up the wall. But I felt this urge to save them and protect them. But as I got better with the treatment, I realized, no, it was a selfish reason I was doing these these compulsions, rather, because if I didn't do the compulsion, I suffered. I had to be anxious and up all night and stressing out. So once I started to learn that, I'm like, this isn't about keeping them safe. It's about feeding the OCD to keep it quiet. I need to learn to live with the uncertainty and to push through this discomfort and go for, so my values was actually to spend time with my grandma, my youngest sister, and I wasn't living by my values because I was avoiding them like the plague because of OCD. So when clients say my value is to keep my family safe, so I'm doing all these compulsions, it's like, no, your value is to spend time and love your family. You're not doing that. You're spending more time with the compulsions and not with them.
100%.
The one wonderful thing about OCD treatment, there are a lot of problems where if you're going to help the person, it doesn't necessarily help the people around them. If I have a couple with marital problems, it might be that divorce is the best thing, but that's going to be messy. It's going to be hard on the kids and everything. OCD is so cool in this just one respect. Like, it's not cool, but right. But it's the one problem where you get better and everybody gets better. Like, it's great for everyone. So that's kind of like cool. Like that's why I said, we want to think about what does exposure mean? It's not just confronting your fear. It actually is living your values more.
100%. Chris, I'm going to throw the next question to you. My OCD centers around health and hygiene / contamination. You mentioned today that the ritual will not eliminate all the risk, and I can easily apply this to the contamination OCD, but I'm struggling to understand how it applies to worries about my health. I'll have obsessive thoughts about a symptom and believe it's terminal until I consult a doctor. If the ritual is consulting the doctor for reassurance, then surely this will eliminate the risk, assuming I trust the doctor. Is it just that in this case it doesn't apply and I'll need to treat my health OCD differently than contamination?
Yeah, so as somebody whose main OCD for most of the time was health OCD, getting the reassurance from your doctor, let me tell you about, making multiple appointments a week with doctors, because that was my life for such a long period of time. what happens is you're once again wanting to eliminate uncertainty. You're wanting to know 100% that your health is okay. And the way that the OCD, just like in my case, has identified to do that is to go to various doctors, call doctors, et cetera, see appointments for them to give you a clean bill of health so that you can feel good. The problem is, if it really worked, why do you have to keep calling new doctors every single week? If this was really this foolproof plan that you could get back to normal life, then how come we then become more and more engaged with doctor's appointments, WebMD, Googling? And so once again, you're not living in uncertainty. Most of the time, we don't have a reason to even call the doctors in the first place, or we're scanning for problems and bumps and things like that as well. So once again, I mean, as somebody who had both contamination and health OCD, I didn't treat those two things differently in my own case. It was exactly the same treatment. Sure, the fear was different. I mean, I had some some crossover on both, but genuinely my contamination led to other fears as the health led to other fears. You were talking, John, earlier about a client with fears of cancer. That was one of my fears. So what I had to learn, using a real life example of living with uncertainty, I created a threshold. So what I meant by that is, if I have a pain or something like that, I'm going to give it 2 weeks. If in 2 weeks that pain has gotten louder, there's no way anyone can mistake it for OCD, then I'll make an appointment. But I'm not going to make this quick decision every time I feel something. So yes, it was really difficult in those weeks before I'd make a final decision, because it was a lot of uncertainty and I'd get a lot of intrusive thoughts about getting sick. Or you read those articles about people, if you just would have come in 15 minutes sooner, you would have survived that cancer or something like that. But that was the uncertainty and the risk I was willing to take for the better for my mental health. So I guess to me, it wouldn't be different between the contamination and the health OCD. It's exactly the same thing. And look, one last thing, and then I'll open up to both of you. In your question, you said, and I felt the same way, we're going to eliminate risk by seeing a doctor. Well, how do we know that doctor's right? You could go see a doctor, they could tell you you're fine, and they could be wrong anyway. So none of our compulsions are foolproof. And that's why it doesn't make sense to consistently count on them, because they're not going to do the job either. And that's when we start demanding more and more certainty. And pretty soon your healthcare provider wants to cancel you because you're going to a new doctor each day.
And there's a subtle problem with that whole question, and the subtle problem is that they're not taking Liz and I seriously. That is, no, but I'll tell you what I mean, because it's like, oh, I'll deal with this uncertainty stuff for all that OC stuff that's not real.
Right.
But what about the real stuff? And we're like, no, uncertainty is for everything. We're saying it can be real. I think, for us, when I'm treating somebody, there is for each individual OC person, there might be a difference in the odds of something occurring. Something might be really unlikely versus it could be reasonably likely. But I'm not addressing those odds as a reassurance, because, in low odds, it doesn't work when you want no odds. So yeah, you're more likely to have cancer than be abducted by aliens, I think. but I don't care. If whatever your problem is, let's address it. And yes, they're real things. That's why if people, when you were saying earlier, if you get better from OCD, you're not normal, you're better than normal. It's because we're dealing with real things, real uncertainties, and things that can be really horrible. But, again, right, if I check a lump at 2 o'clock today, why am I checking it in an hour? And the doctor says it's okay, but he still didn't explain why it's there and what if it's wrong. And I shouldn't have to live like this. So there's got to be something they can do, because they must be missing something. And all we know is well, they don't think it's serious enough. So I have to keep my fingers crossed, as I do in all life, because forget that lump. I have a zillion diseases I could have that I can't even check the symptoms for, that are all as reasonably likely. So,
you were literally in my head back then. What you just said.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean,
but I love it. I love the fact that I think we can always justify our OCD behaviors. We can always justify compulsions of well, no, this one was rooted in reality, or this one. So my husband's an engineer, and I feel like I'm constantly having to explain to him that we shouldn't use logic. And so even the other day,
good luck.
I had this trigger. It was the evening, it was dark, and a cat like darted in front of our car when we were driving home. And I was like, oh, and he could tell I was triggered. And he's like, if you're going to be worried about that, let's just go back and check. And I was like, what'd you just say? And he was like, well, why worry? And I was like, Matt, like, you know, OCD treatment, what are you doing right now? Like, no, I'm not going back to check. Well, I mean, Liz, if you're going to be bothered by it, let's just do it. And I was like, you don't get it. Like, what, like, but because for him, everything is logical. Like, well, if you're worried, we'll go back. You'll see it was a cat. It'll be fine. And it's like, no, you don't get this. And so we can always justify it, but it's really, we know what we're doing. And if it feels urgent, make it not urgent. And like Chris said, right? Like if I feel like I made a clinical error, I've learned that like, oh, I'll talk about that in peer supervision if I'm still worried about it next Tuesday at noon when we meet. But if I want to call somebody right away to get reassurance, probably OCD in that moment.
Sadly, your husband gave you the advice that most of the therapists I went to before getting a specialist gave me. So he has a job.
Oh, yeah, he could. Yeah, he could get a job that he shouldn't be paid to have or do. So two questions kind of co-occurred. There was a question earlier that was asked about whether we should do stepwise exposures and whether they should kind of be done on a hierarchy basis. And then someone else asked, when you do ERP higher up on the hierarchy, should we keep bringing up the obsessions and compulsions or just allow them to naturally occur? So I'm guessing the question is, I'm not sure.
I think I know what they mean.
Okay.
I think with regard to, well, the one you put on the screen, I'll answer that one first. I'm thinking they mean, I'm gonna make a guess even though I'm not certain. I'm thinking they're kind of thinking, oh, I've gone higher up enough and I don't actually have to do formal exposure. I can just let the natural things occur in the environment.
Got it.
And the answer is no, do not just wait for them to naturally occur, because one of the reasons we do exposure is to try to be ready. Most people will tell you that it is not easy, but easier to do a planned exposure than one that catches you off guard. You know, and there's actually, I won't go into it. There are learning principle reasons why one that catches you off guard is harder. And so one reason we do a lot of exposure, one reason we try to have people listen to scripts constantly is, I mean, you know the script pretty quickly, except you'll also notice that in the middle of the surprise exposure, you suddenly forget everything. So the reason for the frequency is we are literally trying to raise the odds that when you get hit by something, the positive therapy thoughts will come in your mind, positive, like, all right, I got to do all this stuff, as opposed to, okay, I got to, you know, and so we're, you know, because again, what you do most, what you practice most will be the most likely response. I'm afraid that everything is odds, even like, are you likely to do treatment or not? So the frequency of exposure is to like stay in shape. It's like, you know, once you can run 10 miles, it's not like, well, I can run 10 miles, so now I don't have to practice anymore. You don't practice, you're not going to be able to run 10 miles. If you don't keep weeding that beautiful garden, it's going to be overrun with weeds. So yes, you need to keep working on it.
Absolutely. Next question is, it seems taboo to some extent to say that ERP doesn't work for a high percentage of people with OCD. I don't think we ever said that. So I want to hear other people's thoughts on what else could possibly help these folks. So I'm wondering if this individual is saying that ERP doesn't help everybody. And so what else or what other treatment interventions might exist? You know,
and not a surprise. I don't see ERP not working. You know, I mean, I have seen ERP done poorly. You know, I mean, one of the nice things about being a psychiatrist, you know, if I give somebody a medication, I know exactly what I did. I gave X medication at X dose. There's no question. Somebody says they've had our ERP. I've got no idea what they had. You know, so we do have the problem of, yeah, poorly done ERP doesn't work. Liz and I keep reminding you constantly, we see people who have ERP, but nobody addressed the uncertainty. And so it didn't work. So like, it's not a surprise to me. There's a small percentage of people who don't want to accept uncertainty. And since I don't, you know, by the way, if anybody knows how to be 100% certain and can convince me, I will pay them. Good luck at convincing me, but that would be part of it, right? So living with uncertainty is critical part of that. So saying it doesn't work, you know, I do think there might be, you know, I think The one group for whom it might not work is that somebody where the biological portion is really strong and we are finding no medication or intervention that's lowering that. So it's really an incredible struggle for them. But that's an extreme case. I said more often it's people who we haven't talked into learning to accept uncertainty, and there's a smaller group who simply resist it. You're talking, Chris, about at one point it's like, well, I'm protecting my family, and I've had clients, it's like, yeah, I don't care. I'm protecting them. I'm doing this great thing. But that's not ERP not working. And there are some other things we attempt to do there. But we, like in that case, we were trying to do strategic pressure. But we're still, in a sense, doing ERP. We're just trying to find a way to implement it. But that's a treatment of last resort. So how much can we get into convincing? This ERP is not really a hard treatment to do. The skill is getting somebody to do it.
What I wanted to add to that too is I agree with you, John. I also always question when people say ERP didn't work for me. I ask them, what does work look like? Because if your work is, I want to be free of thought, intrusive thoughts, I want to be free of discomfort, I want to be free of anxiety. Well, no, ERP isn't going to work because nothing is going to work for that person except death, because everybody's going to have thoughts throughout their lives. Everybody's going to have feelings and stuff. So when people say it didn't work for me, I've had clients say, hey, ERP hasn't worked for me in the past. Yet they'll tell me about how at one point they were housebound and could barely function, and now they can function. But they're like, yeah, but I still struggle. And it's like, okay, but let's look at how far you came with ERP. The other thing is what you're saying as well, John, is sometimes people just aren't ready. They need to get on a medication first. Maybe they have a lot of enabling coming from the family. They could have a co-occurring disorder that's, somebody who has a co-occurring depression to the point that they can't really get out of bed and function. Well, sure, they're not going to most likely get up each day and do planned exposure. So what I tell people is it might not be that ERP doesn't work. You just might not have been ready, because we'll have people that come to us who are like, I'm finally ready to do treatment, and they may have gone through other treatment providers, and they'll tell me who they've seen in the past, and I know them, they're part of our community, and I know they do good work. So I'm like, okay, and then they do well with me, and I don't get an ego boost. I just recognize that maybe at 21 that person wasn't ready to do treatment, but after living with OCD and seeing all the things they care about fall apart, and now they're 32 and they want to start a family and they have more of a buy-in, and they're doing ERP now. It wasn't that ERP didn't work in the past. They might have not been ready. So I think those are some of the things that can come up that are much more likely than ERP just simply not working.
And our version of ERP isn't an overly simplified, at its core it is, but it's not an overly simplified, you're scared of this, let's do it. We all incorporate ACT and a whole bunch of other principles into it. We incorporate them all in the service of ERP, but it's not just, oh, scared of this, do it. There is more to it. And everything else you said was correct.
One last thing I want to add, and I'm going to give Liz credit for this one. We spoke together at a conference last year, and in my own case, I was very volatile, anger and stuff like that when I was in my teens. And, we were talking about it. If a client comes in and they're doing a lot of engaging in a lot of self-harm, or let's say a client is coming in and they're physically hitting their parents and stuff because the parents won't accommodate, purposely dysregulating them with ERP, especially if they have no buy-in, may not be the best treatment at that moment. It doesn't mean that ERP doesn't work. It just might not be best at that time. So an example is I've had clients come in that are actively suicidal. They're harming themselves. They'll go work with somebody who works with a specified maybe DBT treatment, gets them to the point that they're no longer, self-harm, or they might go into a residential, and so they're no longer actively suicidal. Now they can come and do ERP. So I think that's the thing too, is I know that you've both talked about it. Alec Pollard has talked about it, is like sometimes we might push ERP too quickly if somebody's not ready for other circumstances. But trust me, the ERP works. We have the data to back it up. We're lived experience on this. Just make sure that you're getting a proper provider, but also that you're at a place that you're ready for it.
Totally. Next question. Sorry, we've got so many. So does your exposure, we talked a little bit about this already, so I'm going to skip that one. How do I differentiate, great question, between a compulsion and validation?
I wonder what they're meaning by validation.
I wonder if maybe we could even describe the difference between assurance versus reassurance?
Go for it.
I hate explaining it. Okay, so compulsion versus validation. So here's what I'll say. Again, we can always justify compulsions. So if you feel like it's just calling it validation is a way to justify it, don't call it that, call it a compulsion, number one. Number two, if it makes you feel better right away, it's probably a compulsion or a ritual. If it doesn't, so for example, I actually think validation can happen in uncertainty, right? So I might say like, oh yeah, maybe I'm going to get a disease, maybe not. Like, oh, well, going to keep moving on. And it might like, I guess it could kind of validate your thought a little bit. But if the validation is like, oh, well, I just need, especially if it's like a real life or a past memory or something where we're justifying it of like, oh, well, I know like this is actually valid. I need some answers here. And like, there's like validation that needs to come first before I can do ERP. No, there isn't. Because again, that's never going to serve as real certainty and will just get you more caught in the trap. So many people have great questions. Yes, this will be posted later. A question that continued about health anxiety at 11:24 a.m. from Patricia. How does someone with health OCD, which is triggered by pain, accept uncertainty when they are okay until the pain strikes or in fear of it coming back and or being permanent?
Can I go?
Please.
I mean, I think, the thing about, there are a few parts to that question. I may have a pain and, I feel reasonably certain that this person has gone to numerous doctors. And so, one issue is, doctors can't cure everything. And so, yes, you might have to learn to live with that pain. I mean, if I go to some place and nobody knows how to do it, and I've gone to all this, I've gone to specialists, yes, you may have to live with it. And they say, how do I live with the fear of it coming back or being permanent? Well, it's crazy to say it's never going to come back. But and I've seen people have a lot of rituals to try to magically prevent the pain from coming back. As if you don't know, like, I avoid all these things because it might lead to this pain. I have all these rituals and probably they're not even preventing the pain. So the rule is like, well, what are you going to do if it actually comes back? Because that seems reasonably realistic. I did a woman with just that fear. And we talked about that the first session. And, and part of the horror of the pain that she had was that the first time the pain hit her, way before treatment, she handled it in an OCD way. So the entire pain experience was way worse than it had to be because she was engaged in a gazillion rituals around that pain, as opposed to learning to cope with it. So it could come back. It could be permanent. I mean, I'm almost speechless because that seems really possible with something physical. And the answer is like, what would you do? This individual saying like, well, that's it. And it would, I think we said last time, acceptance sucks. It's the second best life. I don't want to live with a life with pain forever. And the goal is like, well, let's try to figure out how to do that and how to, what's the compromise we can make, because you may not be able to get rid of it. There are ways to cope with it that will work to greater or lesser extent, but nobody can guarantee that it's going to be totally gone. So how do I learn to live with it? And if somebody say, but that's really hard, I would validate that. Yeah, this would suck if you have this pain. But do I want to make the best of my life with it or not? And I really want to learn to not screw up my life before it happens, because I'd really like to enjoy my life till it happens. And it would really suck to screw up my entire life and it never happens.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. Real quick analogy. I mean, I tell people you can't take your car into a car shop and say, okay, I'd like to fix my bumper. There's a big dent. And the workers come out and they look and they're like, but I don't see a dent. Oh yeah, but inevitably at some point, somebody's going to dent the back of my bumper. So can you fix it now? And they're going to look at you like you're crazy. They're going to say, look, bring your car back in when the dent happens, but we can't pre-fix a dent. And so when a client will say that, well, what if I get chronic pain in 15 years. It's like, well, spending from now until 15 years worrying about it just makes these 15 years suck. So, let's wait until future you comes to that point and then you can handle it. But us spending the next 15 years worrying about something that may not ever occur, like you were saying, John, is a waste of time. So you got to take that car back in when there's an actual dent versus taking it every day, hoping they can prefix a dent that hasn't occurred.
And a lot of times people say, but I can't do that. And I like to point out, we hope we're good for something. Because, because it's like, yeah, I agree you can't do that. That's what we want to teach you how to do, how to live like that, as opposed to, again, well, just do it because it's not happening now, so stop worrying. Like no one with OCD has ever had that thought before. Right, we're going to teach you how to cope with having that hang over your head. I always ask people, do they want to be maimed, paralyzed, or disfigured? They usually say no, and point out that every time you get in a car, you risk that. We're trying to make it like that. You don't get in the car and say, I know I'm not going to get killed. I hope I'm not. My brilliant plan is I'm going to not deal with it till I'm bleeding out, crushed under the metal.
Yeah, good plan. But it's interesting because it really, like, I think that's the point, is that what we know is that for those of you who have OCD, you might be sitting here saying, well, I don't accept uncertainty, or like, I have to have certainty in everything. No, you don't. There is no way you live your life having certainty for everything. You might try to find it, but I can promise you there's things that you accept the uncertainty all the time. You just don't even recognize it because you're not worried about it, or you're not anxious about it, or you're not triggered by it. Right. But OCD makes anytime we have to accept uncertainty be in our face. Right. It's right there. It's really scary. It's really terrifying. But if you think about it, and we presented this last time, you accept it anyways. We talked about, you see that Band-Aid on the cashier at the checkout, but how do you know the stalker didn't have Band-Aid that put the groceries up off the shelf you grabbed to begin with? How do you know, right? You are already accepting lots of uncertainty. You're just choosing not to acknowledge it. And for many of us, we hope we don't have to, or we don't want to. But the reality is that if we face it, and if we do, that's where we'll start to really get freedom. All of our live streams are absolutely recorded, so you can check them later at the IOCDF YouTube. And yeah, so keep going through lots of different things. Why does a certain part of a theme feel like such a non-issue once a new or old part comes back and takes over? This is a great question, because I love this. It's so many times it's like, oh, I wish I had my old OCD, or like, oh, I wish I had that person's OCD because I can handle that, but like, this is the worst. So Chris, take that one.
Yeah, no, I know you both run groups, and it's always funny to hear, because people will tell me, they're like, man, I'm in group and I wish I had everybody else's OCD. And I'm like, I promise you don't. I mean, OCD, I always tell people, OCD has to pick something important to you. If OCD was attacking broccoli, or your neighbor's cat, and you don't like cats or something, you probably wouldn't feel as involved. OCD has to stay relevant. And so, for instance, if a client is off at school and they have pedophilia OCD, but their college campus doesn't have a lot of kids, they might struggle a little bit more with perfectionism with grades or another subtype, and then they come home and it's back to the pedophilia OCD. And so a lot of times it's based on relevancy. But what I always tell people, what's more important is to say, look, if something was a real fear, like a real actual fear that society in general fears, it couldn't just possibly fade away just over time like it does with OCD. So we have to start to look at that, get curious. How come you could be so afraid of one thing, and then now that just simply vanishes and you're afraid of something else? Maybe it's not really about that theme in the first place, and it's more of the fear of uncertainty and fear of something bad happening. So I use that as an advantage to show people, like, if this was real, you wouldn't be able to just skip around so seamlessly. And it helped me in my own care, because I would, my therapist would say, wow, you're doing all these things. I thought it really bothered you. Yeah, but now I'm way more focused on the harm. And so it's like, okay, well, did you see how quickly you could abandon something that felt so real? What does that tell you? And that helped me understand that it's more in my head than actual reality.
I can tell you what the worst form of OCD is. Oh, you want to know? Yes?
Yeah. I'm waiting. I'm at the edge of my seat.
The worst form of OCD is whichever one you're suffering from in the present.
Oh, for sure.
Always.
Absolutely.
Always. Okay, so next question, we're going to switch a little to can find the contact info for you three. You can definitely go to contact you can contact anyone through the live streams at just contacting IOCDF, and they'll pass it along as appropriate, or we will work hard to answer those questions in our next live streams. But we're going to move for a second to family dynamics. So at 11:38, Rachel said, how can you support your loved one in the case it's my teenage daughter who through ERP if you are one of her triggers? She lives with my stepdaughter now as a result. This is a great question, and I know really tough, and I can only imagine how hard it would be as a parent when you're going through that.
It's so important, and one of the things that makes support hard is the daughter engaged in active treatment? Because again, if she's engaged in active treatment, she can allow you to help her. If she's not engaged in active treatment, it's kind of a horrible problem, because it's really hard. Again, it's like if you're living with an alcoholic, if they're trying to be straight, you can support them. I feel like I need a drink and help them not do it. But if they want to drink no matter what, now you're just in another battle. So that's a question we often get asked that I would love to have the magic answer to. But because our first problem is, can we convince them to do treatment? And often that's like the major problem that's keeping somebody stuck for years.
That's right. Yeah. And I will just say, I think you're here, you're doing what you can to get educated and to be of support. And so this would really be something I'd want to work together with her specialist. If she's, hopefully she's seeing an OCD specialist, and to really say, what will it look like for me to start being able to do helpful exposures and work with her? And I know I can say this, but it probably doesn't feel it, but this is OCD. This isn't personal. And I see this all the time at the clinic and everywhere we are, where people's OCD greatly impacts their ability to have relationships with their family. And when their family members are triggering, there's a lot of shame and other things that come along with it. And so, the more you can be helpful support and let her know without pushing her that you're here when she's ready, and that, you love her and you want to support her, I think that's the best you could probably do.
Yeah, I mean, great point, Liz, because I do hear a lot of times that the parents feel so guilty. And a lot of times if the person is acting out, it's learning that they're not angry at you. It's just that unfortunately the OCD has latched onto you and uses you as their trigger. And so if they are saying nasty things, or if they're ignoring your phone calls, I know it's impossible to not feel it, but as an adult or a loved one or a support system, just recognize that the OCD has attacked you, but the loved one doesn't hate you. It just may feel like that at that moment.
Totally. So I want to be cognizant that we have 4 minutes left, and we will continue to answer these questions in coming up live streams. I can't promise another one because we'll keep doing that and keep promising. And then John, you just have to agree to be a constant guest, which we're okay with too. So
yeah, I was going to say this, like I enjoy doing this. There's so many questions, and it's so many people who always need help. It's hard to say no.
It is. Yeah. And I think just a reminder, that's why we do these, right? And it's always our job to bring on guests and to think about how we can best serve the OCD community. And so if you'd like to see us continue this conversation, I can promise we will, regardless whether you want us to or not, but we'll continue to talk about how ERP can be done in the most useful ways, what it looks like in practice. And I'm just grateful to work alongside two such amazing and incredible clinicians who really get it and who I know are changing so many lives. So thank y'all for your time, and final words that you have.
I'll go quickly. We'll give John the final. I mean, every time we do this, I mean, I already saw somebody's like, do part 3. I mean, it always makes me sad how many people out there aren't having access to treatment and care. And that's why I love these live streams. I just think back when I was struggling, it would be great to come and, tap into someone like John, and Liz. But what I do want to say is, keep fighting. I mean, keep moving forward. I always think that that's the way. It may not look the way that you want it to look, but I saw somebody in the comments say that they have an upcoming event in May that's really triggering. Should they start treatment now? Should they wait? Start treatment now. I don't think anybody ever regrets finding good treatment and starting treatment now. So that would be my final thought, is if you can find access to care in your area, the IOCF.org, there's a find help search engine part. Please go get help now. Liz and I have never regretted getting help. John's probably never seen a client regret getting help. So please, please, please get help when you can.
And I'd like to end with what I said basically last time, that the two of you if you know, to the extent, you know, people know your history, you know, had been through hell. And I mean, you are special people, but you coming through is proof that they can. And although you're really special, you're not so special that you could do something nobody else could do. That's right. So they should kind of take inspiration that this is possible, because the two of you really went through hell to come out this side. And that's what we want to help everyone do.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank y'all for joining. Can't wait to see you in a couple weeks. I think next week, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is Research Roundtable. So we will not have a webinar. Well, we will not be on a webinar, but there will absolutely be a webinar at noon on Wednesday. It'll be the Research Symposium with John Abramowitz, Dr. Abramowitz, and Kyle King. And then we'll be back to see you guys in a couple weeks.
Yeah, so they're doing hoarding on the 9th, and we'll be back on the 16th.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, John. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.